It's a familiar situation for any gamer. You find yourself face to face with an enemy so deadly, the slightest contact will lead to your immediate doom. With tremendous strength, you propel yourself high into the air and land with devastating force on the enemy's head. You continue on your way, leaving your foe broken and battered behind you. The Goomba Stomp, where players defeat enemies by jumping on their heads, is one of the most iconic and enduring mechanics in video game history. It's so ubiquitous that I didn't even know it had a name. But recently I started wondering, what game did it first? There's hundreds, if not thousands of games that let you stomp on enemies. But someone had to have started it. Someone had to have been first. When you hear stomping on enemies, you're probably already thinking of Mario. It's right there in the name Goomba Stomp. When doing research for this video, whenever I did see a definitive answer, Mario was usually it. But could the answer really be that simple? That the most obvious answer was the correct one, and it all started right where everyone thought it had? Seemed too easy. It's pretty common that there's a first game to do something, and then a little later there's the first game to do it really well. You've probably played Bejeweled, Candy Crush, or the hundreds of other Match 3 games. But have you ever even heard of Shiriki? There's tons of games with slow-mo bullet time powers, but when was the last time you heard someone talk about Requiem, Avenging Angel, the one that did it first? So even though Mario is the most famous head stomper, it's quite possible he's not the first. But if it wasn't Mario, and there really was a more obscure game with this mechanic, then what was it? Younger gamers may be surprised to learn that Mario wasn't always stomping on heads. Mario's first appearance in Donkey Kong had him scoring points for jumping over obstacles. Landing directly on them was dangerous for Mario. The only way he really had to destroy obstacles was with the hammer power-up. You probably know it better from Super Smash Bros. Mario still didn't have this ability in the classic Mario Bros. Game, featuring the first appearance of Luigi. In this game, the brothers had to hit enemies from below to stun them, before they could attack them directly. An aerial attack on an unstunned enemy was the same as running into them directly. It wasn't until the release of Super Mario Bros. On the Famicom/NES that Mario could defeat enemies by jumping on them. So that was the first place Mario could do it. But was it the first game ever with this head-stomping ability? Super Mario Bros., or if you grew up with an NES, you probably know it better as Mario 1, was released in 1985. So we're looking at games that came before that. Now, it's widely accepted that the first game with a jump button was the 1978 arcade game Frogs. But that game didn't really have any enemies, so it's not the game we're looking for. The first platformer game is sometimes cited as Donkey Kong, but the more generally accepted answer is the 1980 game Space Panic. Though interestingly, Space Panic didn't have the ability to jump at all. Instead, the player climbed ladders and defeated enemies by digging holes and burying enemies that fell in. I'm going to make a bit of an assumption that the first stomp-capable game is going to be a platformer, so that leaves us with a roughly 5-year period for a potential non-Mario head-stomping game to have come out. That seems easy enough, right? How many games were even coming out before 1985? It's not like now, where Steam probably added 5 games in the time it took me to say this sentence. Turns out it's more than you might think. There's almost 200 games released in 1980 alone. So while we can easily ignore a lot of these, it's still probably too many games to go through one at a time. I started with the famous platformers, the ones that pop up when you're talking about classics of the genre. I also got a little desperate and just started asking ChatGPT to tell me what game I should be looking at. It was not super helpful, but it did give me some places to start. A lot of early platform games like Moon Patrol don't really have enemies you can jump on at all. It makes sense that you can't defeat a rock or a hole by jumping on it. A lot of early platformers were known as climbing games and didn't have any jumping at all. Crazy Climbers would be one example. The arcade game Mappy lets you pass through enemies while falling or jumping, but the only way to temporarily defeat them is to hit them with these doors. Pitfall was impressive at the time for having levels that took up more than one screen, and for being a successful console game that wasn't based on an already existing arcade game. Also interesting is that it starred a young Jack Black in the commercials. It requires players to jump over most obstacles. Jumping on things like the scorpions is no good. There are some crocodiles that you have to carefully jump on to cross some obstacles. Classic Jungle King was mostly vine swinging and swimming. The few enemies that you can jump over hold spears that you really don't want to jump on. Congo Bongo, sort of a 2.5D Donkey Kong inspired platformer. Jumping on enemies either has no effect or counts as a hit on you. I went through quite a few games that jumping on a bad guy is basically the same as running into him. It hurts you, doesn't hurt them. And then I played Kangaroo. 1982's Kangaroo features a kangaroo trying to get past monkeys as it climbs up to the top of a tree. If you can get close to the monkeys, you can punch them to knock them out and score points. And look at this. You can jump on monkeys to defeat them. Sure, this also knocks you out as well, so you're not going to get very far doing it, but still, this game came out in 1982, a full 3 years before Super Mario Bros., and it has, technically, a working head stomp. Could this be the earliest example of a game that defeats enemies by jumping on their heads? Well, no. It turns out the monkeys do the exact same thing if you just run directly into them. It doesn't matter if you're jumping, it doesn't notice at all, it's just you're running into them, it's the same thing. The Fairyland story only came out a few months before Super Mario. It's probably my favorite of these classic platformers. You can technically safely jump onto an enemy and ride them around. They tend to jump pretty quickly after you do it, and then that counts as a hit on you. Your main attack is to use magic to turn the enemies into cakes. Charming. At this point, you can push those cakes off ledges before they change back to destroy them. The interesting bit is that the cakes can crush other enemies that they land on. So we're seeing sort of the idea of the head stomp. Hilariously, the enemies can also use the cakes to crush you as well. Dropping objects on enemies to crush them is definitely more common at this point in time than jumping on them to crush them. A similar mechanic can be seen in the 1982 arcade game Burger Time. I really thought I might have been onto something with the game Pac-Land. It's an odd game. It's based on a Pac-Man cartoon, which itself was based on the original Pac-Man arcade game. When doing a little research, I read something that said Shigeru Miyamoto, the creator of Mario, had mentioned taking some inspiration from Pac-Land. Perhaps that inspiration regards a certain jumping ability? Turns out, not the game we're looking for. Interestingly, it does differ from a lot of these other ones by, again, letting you jump on enemies and just kind of hang out there. But the only way to defeat them is the same as the classic Pac-Man. You have to find a big power pellet so they turn blue, and then you can bump into them, which I guess is eating them. Still, this gave me another idea. Maybe instead of looking at random games, I should start with the earliest stomping game we know about, and then work backwards. What if the developers of Mario had seen another game that had given them the idea for jumping on enemies? If I could find an interview, book, article at some point that mentioned it, we know exactly what game we should be looking at. Mario's creator, Shigeru Miyamoto, has given a ton of interviews over the last 40 years, as have a lot of other big names at Nintendo. With a little bit of digging, I was able to find a link to an interview from 2010, originally posted on the gaming site oneup.com, which I think went offline about 10 years ago. The link turned out to be dead, but the Wayback Machine had an archive copy. In this interview, Miyamoto talked about the development of several early Mario titles. While speaking about Super Mario Bros., he says, quote, "Our idea was that direct contact with an enemy would kill you, but hitting them from below could knock them out. That wound up being too boring, so we settled on the final system where you first knock them off their feet, then jump back up to deliver the final blow. So Mario Bros. Made it out, and after we reflected upon it, we realized that it made no sense that you could get killed in Mario Bros. When you jumped on a turtle's back. If you did that, the turtle would come out the worst from it, wouldn't it? So we decided that if we had the chance to make another Mario game, we'd definitely have it so you could jump on the turtles all you want." And jump on the turtles we certainly did. So, interesting, but I'm afraid it's another dead end. Mario's ability to eliminate enemies via jumping seems to be an original idea and not something that was seen in another game. It makes sense. Miyamoto was a visionary of game design. He created Donkey Kong, Mario, all the Legend of Zelda games. He repeatedly created or redefined entire genres. So I guess it should be expected that Goomba Stomping was also a new idea. The end result was that I couldn't find a game that had a Mario-style head stomp ability, but I do want to point out two games in particular. The first is Joust, released in 1982, and Balloon Fight, released in 1984. Both play in a pretty similar manner. In Joust, you control a knight riding a sort of flying ostrich. You do battle with other knights. When the player and an enemy collide, the character who is higher up will knock the other one off their mount. Balloon Fight works in a similar manner. Characters are suspended from balloons, and the goal is to run into your enemy's balloons while protecting your own. Both games have similar controls, where you're not quite flying, you mash a button to go up while gravity pulls you down, similar to swimming controls in a lot of other games. In both games, it's possible to defeat an enemy by crashing into them from above. Does this count as a Goomba Stomp? Is Joust, the earlier of these games, the first game that lets you stomp on an enemy to defeat them? Maybe? It's not the perfect example I was looking for, but it kind of works. I guess it depends on what you consider to be a jump. I'd like to posit that it should count. You're standing on a platform, press a button to hop into the air, come down on an enemy, and they are defeated. Does the ability to flap your arms negate the jumpiness of the action? I hate to be the let me know in the comments guy, but I honestly want to know where people land on this one, so let me know in the comments. And that's where I'll have to end this one for now. I wish I had a more solid example of some old, forgotten, groundbreaking game, but there just might not be one. I'd love to do a future video where I take a look at all the 150-ish platformer games released in that period, but for now, the first Goomba Stomp is either in Super Mario Bros. Or Joust, depending on your definition. If you think there's another game I should look at, or if you have some other weird or dumb question you'd like to see answered, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.